Welcome to another episode of Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism. 2. Latency, period, and tradition. I thus believe that the idea of an only God, as well as the emphasis laid on ethical demands in the name of that God, and the rejection of all magic ceremonial, were indeed Mosaic doctrines, which are first found no hearing, but came into their own after a long space of time and finally prevailed. How is such a delayed effect to be explained, and where do we meet with similar phenomena? Our next reflection tells us that they are often met within very different spheres, and that they probably come about in various ways which are more or less easy to understand. Let us take for an example the fate of any new scientific theory. For instance, the Darwinian doctrine of evolution. At first, it meets with hostile rejection and is violently debated for decades. It takes only one generation, however, before it is recognized as a great step towards truth. Darwin himself was accorded the honor of burial in Westminster Abbey. Such a case provides no enigma. The new truth had awakened effective resistances. These could be sustained by arguments that opposed the evidence in support of the unpleasant doctrine. The contest of opinions lasted a certain time. From the very beginning, there were both adherents and opponents, but the number as well as the importance of the former steadily increased, until at last they gained the upper hand. During the whole time of the conflict, no one forgot what was the matter at issue. We are hardly surprised to find that the whole process took a considerable time. Probably we do not adequately appreciate the fact that we have here to do with a manifestation of mass psychology. There is no difficulty in finding a full analogy to it in the mental life of an individual. In such a case, a person would hear of something new, which on the ground of certain evidence he is asked to accept as true. Yet it contradicts many of his wishes and offends some of his highly treasured convictions. He will then hesitate, look for arguments to cast doubt on the new material, and so will struggle for a while until at last he admits it himself. Quotation: all this is true after all, although I find it hard to accept, and it is painful to have to believe in it. End of quotation. All we learn from this process is that it needs time for the intellectual work of the ego to overcome objections that are invested by strong feelings. This case, however, is not very similar to the one we are trying to elucidate. The next example we turn to seems to have still less in common with our problem. It may happen that someone gets away from apparently unharmed, the spot where he has suffered a shocking accident, for instance, a train collision. In the course of the following weeks, however, he develops a series of grave psychological and motor symptoms, which one can ascribe only to his shock or whatever else happened at the time of the accident. He has developed, in quotation marks, traumatic neurosis. This appears quite incomprehensible and is therefore a novel fact. The time that elapsed between the accident and the first appearance of the symptoms is called, in quotation marks, incubation period, a transparent allusion to the pathology of infectious disease. As an afterthought, we observe that in spite of the fundamental difference in the two cases, the problem of the traumatic neurosis and that of Jewish monotheism, there is a correspondence in one point. It is the feature which one might term latency. There are the best grounds for thinking that in the history of the Jewish religion, there is a long period after the breaking away from the Moses religion, during which no trace is to be found of the monotheistic idea, the condemnation of ceremonial, and the emphasis on the ethical side. Thus, we are prepared for the possibility that the solution of our problem is to be sought in a special psychological situation. I have more than once traced the events in Kadesh when the two components of the later Jewish people combined in the acceptance of a new religion. With those who had been in Egypt, the memory of the Exodus and of the figure of Moses was still so strong and vivid that it insisted on being incorporated into any account of their early history. There might have been among them grandsons of persons who themselves had known Moses, and some of them still felt themselves to be Egyptians and bore Egyptian names. They had good reasons, however, for repressing, in quotation marks, the memory of the fate that had befallen their leader and lawgiver. For the other component of the tribe, the leading motive was to glorify the new God and deny his foreignness. Both parties were equally concerned to deny that there had been an earlier religion, and especially what it contained. This is how the first compromise came about, which probably was soon codified in writing. The people from Egypt had brought with them the art of writing and the fondness for writing history. A long time was to elapse, however, before historians came to develop an ideal of objective truth. At first, they shaped their accounts according to their needs and tendencies of the moment, with an easy conscience, as if they had not yet understood what falsification signified. In consequence, a difference began to develop between the written version and the oral report, i.e., the tradition of the same subject matter. What has been deleted or altered in the written version might quite well have been preserved uninjured in the tradition. Tradition was the complement, and at the same time, the contradiction of the written history. It was less subject to distorting influences, perhaps in part entirely free of them, and therefore might be more truthful than the account set down in writing. Its trustworthiness, however, was impaired by being vaguer and more fluid than the written text, being exposed to many changes and distortions as it was passed on from one generation to the other by word of mouth. Such a tradition may have different outcomes. The most likely event would be for it to be vanquished by the written version, ousted by it, until it grows more and more shadowy, and at last is forgotten. Another fate might be that the tradition itself ends by becoming a written version. There are other possibilities which will be mentioned later. The phenomenon of the latency period in the history of the Jewish religion may find its explanation in this. The facts which the so-called official written history purposely tried to suppress were in reality never lost. The knowledge of them survived in traditions which were kept alive among the people. According to E. Selm, there even existed a tradition concerning the end of Moses, which contradicted outright the official account and came far nearer to the truth. The same thing, we may suppose, happened with other beliefs that had apparently found an end at the same time as Moses. Doctrines of the Mosaic religion that had been unacceptable to the majority of Moses' contemporaries. Here we meet with a remarkable fact. It is that these traditions, instead of growing weaker as time went on, grew more and more powerful in the course of centuries, found their way into the later codifications of the official accounts, and at last proved themselves strong enough decisively to influence the thought and activity of the people. What the conditions were that made such a development possible seems, however, far from evident. This fact is indeed strange, so much so that we feel justified in examining it afresh. Within it, our problem lies. The Jewish people had abandoned the Aton religion which Moses had given them, and had turned to the worship of another god who differed little from the Baalim of the neighboring tribes. All the efforts of later distorting influences failed to hide this humiliating fact. Yet the religion of Moses did not disappear without leaving any trace. A kind of memory of it had survived, a tradition perhaps obscured and distorted. It was this tradition of a great past that continued to work in the background until it slowly gained more and more power over the mind of the people and at last succeeded in transforming the god Jahwe into the Mosaic God and in waking to a new life the religion Moses had instituted centuries ago and which had later been forsaken. That a dormant tradition should exert such a powerful influence on the spiritual life of a people is not a familiar conception. There we find ourselves in a domain of mass psychology where we do not feel at home. We must look around for analogies or facts of a similar nature, even if in other disciplines. We shall find them, I am sure. When the time was ripening for a return of the religion of Moses, the Greek people possessed an exceptionally rich treasure of legends and myths of heroes. It is believed that the 9th or 8th century BC saw the creation of the Homeric epics, which derived their material from this complex of myths. With our psychological knowledge of today, we could long before Schliemann and Evans have put the question, whence did the Greeks obtain all this material of myths and legends, which Homer and the great Attic dramatists transformed into immortal works of art? The answer would have had to be this people probably passed in its early history through a period of outward splendor and highly developed culture, which ended in catastrophe, as indeed history tells, and of which a faint tradition lived on in these legends. Archaeological research of our days has confirmed this suggestion, which, if made earlier, would surely have been considered too bold. It has discovered the evidence of the grandiose Minoan Mycenaean culture, which had probably already come to an end on the Greek mainland by 1250 BC. The Greek historians of a later period hardly ever refer to it. There is the remark that there was a time when the Cretans ruled the sea, a mention of the name of King Minos and his palace, and of the labyrinth, but that is all. Nothing remained of that great time but the traditions seized upon by the great writers. Other peoples also possess such folk epics. For example, the Indians, Finns, and Germans. It is for the literary historian to investigate whether the same conditions as with the Greeks applied there as well. I think that such an investigation would yield a positive result. The conditions we have specified for the origin of folk epics are as follows. There exists a period of early history that immediately afterwards is regarded as eventful, significant, grandiose, and perhaps always heroic. Yet it happened so long ago and belonged to times so remote that later generations receive intelligence of it only as an obscure and incomplete tradition. Surprise has been expressed that the epic as a literary form should have disappeared in later times. The explanation may be that the conditions for the production of epics no longer exist. The old material has been used up, and so far as later events are concerned, history has taken the place of tradition. The bravest heroic deeds of our days are no longer able to inspire an epic. Alexander the Great himself had grounds for his complaint that he would have no Homer to celebrate his life. Remote times have a great attraction, sometimes mysteriously so for the imagination. As often as mankind is dissatisfied with its present, and that happens often enough, it harks back to the past and hopes at last to win belief in the never-forgotten dream of a golden age. Probably man still stands under the magic spell of his childhood, which a not unbiased memory presents to him as a time of unalloyed bliss. Incomplete and dim memories of the past, which we call tradition, are a great incentive to the artist, for he is free to fill in the gaps in the memories according to the behests of his imagination and to form after his own purpose the image of the time he has undertaken to reproduce. One might almost say that the more shadowy tradition has become, the more meet is it for the poet's use. The value tradition has for poetry, therefore, need not surprise us, and the analogy we have found of the dependence of epic poetry on precise conditions will make us more inclined to accept the strange suggestion that with the Jews it was the tradition of Moses which turned the Yahweh worship in the direction of the old Mosaic religion. The two cases, however, are very different in other respects. In the one, the result is poetry. In the other, a religion. And we have assumed that the latter, under the stimulus of a tradition, was reproduced with a faithfulness for which, of course, the epic cannot provide a parallel. Enough remains, therefore, of our problem to encourage search for better analogies. See you in the next episode. Thank you.